It is an unfortunate disposition of some modern intellectuals, particularly those tethered to the left wing, to dismiss or dilute the concept of evil. They prefer to see the world in gentle gradients of grey, where intentions, however diabolical, are always somehow noble at the core, and where human frailty is always the consequence of some societal shortcoming. It is comforting, no doubt, to believe that our world exists in such a palette, where darkness and light seamlessly blend into one another without hard boundaries. And who doesn't indeed crave for such gradations? Yet, as we search for nuance, we must not become blind to clarity. As I have often observed, it is a rare occurrence for ideas to be clear without being simplistic. Sometimes the starkness of good versus evil isn't a product of an unsophisticated worldview, but a reflection of the palpable reality we confront. We are living in times that are eerily reminiscent of the past, though our contemporaries seem remarkably unwilling to admit it. There are echoes of the 1930s when peace in our time was the oft-repeated naive hope of those who would appease tyrants in our current responses to dictatorial aggression. Just as our grandfathers were not mistaken when they faced the black and white atrocities of Germany and Japan, we must not delude ourselves into seeing the incursions of today as mere anomalies that can be explained away or negotiated. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a case in point. This is not merely a geopolitical chess move, it is an act of territorial greed, a display of naked ambition, an affront to the values of international law and order, and yes, a manifestation of evil. This might sound archaic, an outdated term from an old world order, but to the Ukrainians who've seen their homes destroyed, their families torn apart, and their nation's sovereignty trampled upon, it is very much a present reality. For those on the left, it is imperative to remember that confronting evil does not mean abandoning our principles. It doesn't mean resorting to jingoism or blind nationalism. It means understanding that there are moments in history when the line between right and wrong is not blurry but glaringly evident. And in those moments, moral equivocation becomes a sin of its own. The left, with its emphasis on social justice and egalitarianism, has an obligation to stand firm against oppressors. It has always been a force for progress, fighting against the status quo when the status quo meant inequality, injustice, and oppression. Now is not the time for the left to be lulled into a false sense of complexity, where clear-eyed recognition of evil is needed. Throughout history, from the struggles against colonialism to the fight against apartheid, the left has been at the forefront of confronting manifestly evil systems and actions. We need not relinquish this position now. In fact, the world needs us to be that voice, that clarion call, more than ever. There's a particular phrase now often derided in intellectual circles that deserves a moment of our reflection. George W. Bush's axis of evil. At the time, many on the left dismissed it as overly simplistic warmongering rhetoric. But one might wonder if our rejection of it was less about the accuracy of the designation and more about our own yearning for a peaceful world where such axes did not exist. It's an admirable sentiment, certainly, to wish for peace, but not at the cost of ignoring palpable threats and very real manifestations of malevolence. I, for one, have not shied away from calling out these regimes for what they were and remain. Our disdain for the phrase shouldn't cloud our judgment about the realities it pointed to. Whether we agree with every decision of the Bush administration is a separate debate, but in identifying and confronting clear sources of destabilization and tyranny, there was a certain prescience. It's a lesson for the left. It is possible to be peace-loving and yet recognize that there are forces in the world that don't respond to appeasement, but only to strength and resolution. So let this serve as a posthumous confirmation, if you will. In the annals of history, when the passions of the day have cooled, and historians, free from immediate political pressures, examine the early 21st century, they might very well concede that the axis of evil was not just a rhetorical flourish, but a sobering reality. Let's ensure that our desire for peace doesn't blind us to the exigencies of our times. The world, especially its most vulnerable, depends on our clear-eyed judgment.